Stephen Brown is a professor of psychology, neuroscience, and behavior at McMaster University, where he directs the NeuroArts Lab. He's the author of the book, The Unification of the Arts, a framework for understanding what the arts share and why. And he also wrote a groundbreaking paper on actors and their brains called The Neuroscience of Romeo and Juliet. All this amongst many other things. And we want to welcome Stephen Brown.
Thank you, Doreen.
Um, as I mentioned, you do study very broadly the arts, and we've chosen acting because it's a very fascinating area, and you don't see much about it. But there has to be some very interesting things going on in the brain when a person acts. Could you tell us a little bit about this uh, neuroscience of Romeo and Juliet study you did and what you found?
Yeah, so for one thing, we used student actors, so university actors. It was going to be very complicated for us to get professional actors, so we decided to use student actors because we had access to them through the university. So these were also people trained with the so-called method acting approach, that there are different ways of getting into character. And so this is the approach that's used by people like Daniel Day-Lewis and people like that. It's kind of the American school of acting. So we took a bunch of these undergraduate student actors, method actors, and we trained them to answer questions as themselves, but also while being in character as either Romeo or Juliet, depending on their gender. And so all the questions were hypothetical. There was no right or wrong answer. But one question would be, would you go to a party you were not invited to? And there's no right answer. Just, you, Stephen, me, Stephen, I, Stephen, and then I, Romeo, yes or no. So we took these questions because they reflected the play a little bit, because Romeo, in fact, does crash a party that he was not invited to. So we tried to make the questions relevant both to the actors and to the characters. So again, there was no right or wrong answer. Just answer the question either as yourself or the character. And the main thing was to look at what changes in the brain when you're in Romeo or Juliet, when you're in character, versus answering the same types of questions as yourself. And the basic finding in a nutshell is that we found what are called deactivations or reductions in brain activity when people were in Romeo doing the same kind of task, answering questions, compared to answering the questions from their own first person I perspective. So that's kind of the physiology there. Then we have to, as neuroscientists, interpret what that means. And so a lot of acting theories suggest that when you go into character, there's some kind of loss of self or reduction of the self, the character somehow taking over this vessel, which is your body. And so we did, again, all we have is, fMRI data. We don't know exactly what it means, but we interpreted as reflecting what acting theorists talk about as being a loss of self, a reduction of the self when you go into the character. This applies particularly to method actors because they try very hard to become the character, which is different than more what I call gestural approaches, where you don't really care about becoming the character, but simply creating the superficial impression that you're the character by changing your facial expression and voice. But you're not trying to become the character. You're just trying to convey the impression to the audience that you are the character. Inside, it doesn't matter what's happening. But for a method actor, they're really trying to internalize psychologically the character, become the character. So this kind of loss of self is, I think, congruent with the fact that method actors are, in fact, trying to reduce themselves and replace themselves temporarily with their character. So that was kind of the biggest finding, was these deactivations. The main areas that we found an increase in activity for were parts of the brain involved in attention. And so also, according to acting theories, when you go into a character, you have to split your resources between self and character. So of course you want to be the character, but you don't want to fall off the stage when you're acting as well. You have to be aware of this kind of duality between being yourself and being the character. So the main areas where we found an increase in activity for the character compared to the self was brain areas involved in attention. And again, acting theories talk about the split consciousness of going into character, that you have to be the character, but also have control over yourself because, like I said, you don't want to fall off the stage or whatever. You have to be aware of your environment when you're acting. That's kind of the story in a nutshell, is deactivations in sort of self-processing areas, increases in activity in areas associated with attention, maybe reflecting this split consciousness of the actor.
So the gestural style of acting sounds more like a mimicry of sorts.
Much more based on mimicry, imitation. It's much less about becoming, like psychologically immersing yourself, much more about just conveying to the audience that you are the character, however that may come about. And it's usually something much more superficial about, the way you talk, the way you walk, your facial expressions, something much more gestural, but it's not. So this is much more like Royal Shakespeare, the British style, the French style, where it's much more about, putting on a mask basically with your expressions and gestures, and much less the Stanislavski approach of becoming the character. So the outcomes could be very, very much the same. They're great actors coming from both traditions, but they're sort of different routes. People talk about that the method acting is more inside out and the gestural is more outside in. That's a common duality in the acting theory literature.
The other factor that this study sounds like it kind of brings up is the idea of improvisation, because you're giving them something that they kind of have to improvise. And I wondered if there was a difference between improvisatory acting versus memorizing and having a set role, in terms of the brain activity. Have you studied anything about that? Or
Yeah, so we couldn't because we wanted to make sure the conditions were matched between the self and the character. So yes, actors recite recited lines, but we don't. Like we're improvising right now. And so to make these conditions comparable, we had to have them do the same thing. So we had to make both of them do improvisation. If we compared me answering in my improvisational way to an actor reciting recited lines, that wouldn't have been a very, clean comparison. So we couldn't really, unless the self was going to be reciting fixed lines, then we couldn't really do the comparison. So we were kind of forced to make everything improvisational in order to make the conditions matched between the self answering a question and Romeo answering a question. So I don't know the answer to your question. We're actually doing a study right now, separate from acting, in which we're comparing conversation like this with fixed text, the way you might like, chanting a song or something. So I don't know the answer to that question yet, but at least for the actors, we're kind of forced to make the conditions comparable. And so they both have to be improvisational conditions just for experimental purposes.
and I'm sure it varies individual to individual so vastly, depending on how their style, just in general, would make a big difference.
Yeah.
So, um, since you're covering a lot of the arts in your studying, I wondered what the similarities in improvisation would be in acting as it is with music. Is it a similar part of the brain you're using?
Yeah, I mean, so again, we don't know for acting. For music, there is a decent literature looking at musical improvisation, especially mainly with pianists, a little bit with vocalists, but mainly looking at jazz pianists improvising. Um, so at least there, what's been published is sort of a different story, maybe a bit less about the loss of self, although maybe some people have suggested that, but a bit more areas about motor planning, motor control, things like that compared to fixed performance. So like I said, for actors, we don't have any sense of the fixed versus improvised yet. But for the musical literature, they often compare improvising music versus playing something fixed. And so they do have an idea of brain areas, and it's a different story. It's much more, like I said, about areas involved in motor planning and motor control.
Sounds like there's a lot of areas still to be investigated in the neuroscience of acting. I mean, screen acting versus theater acting, and all these different styles portraying an actual person versus an imaginary. It's kind of an endless pool, you think.
Actually, we're interested also in drama therapy, because in drama therapy, I mean, there's some forms in which you're supposed to depict a fictional character, but for example, in psychodrama, you'll depict a close other. So let's say a husband and wife go into psychodrama, then the husband's supposed to become, or, portray the wife and vice versa. So those are not just real people, but people who you know. And so we're actually starting a study now with a group at NYU and a group in Romania to compare fictional characters like our Romeo and Juliet study versus close others, like as might occur in a psychodrama study where you have to now become your wife or your mother or something like that. So actually, we're engaged. We're just starting a study on that right now.
Have there been any comparative studies in the difference between formal acting versus role playing, or even our day-to-day roles that we play, or when we put ourselves into sort of acting situation to get through something, let's say?
Yeah. I mean, for me, there's a really important point of demarcation between what you call the everyday versus acting. And that's when you're acting, you're portraying some person who you're not. And when you're doing the everyday, like I'm a professor in one context and I'm a son in another, like whatever. Those are all versions of myself. So we all have different personas. We call those personas, but they're all ultimately versions of myself. But when I go on stage as Romeo, I'm depicting some other person. And so I think that's the difference between what you call everyday role playing, is that they're all versions of you, of me. But when you're acting in general, you're depicting some other person. You're impersonating someone. It could be, like you said, a real person, a fictional person, an imaginary person. But you've crossed that line that you're no longer yourself. You're presenting yourself. You're speaking as someone else. Whereas my different personas as being like the customer in the store versus professor in a lecture, well, those are all versions of myself. And they're different in different social contexts, but I'm not becoming some other person. I mean, of course, there are examples of imposters who do, in an everyday context, present themselves as someone who they're not, but that's kind of the exception when it comes to the everyday. And we're not aware that they're acting, they're deceiving us.
Right. I was pretty interested in the whole relationship to sociopathy, or, I mean, can you learn from studying acting anything about pathologies when it comes to lying or,
Yeah, I mean, those would be natural applications, and we talk about that in our article about applications to things like deception and imposters, things like that. I can't tell you much about that from a brain standpoint, but those are the kinds of questions that we'd want to address. What's happening when someone's acting as an imposter? They're acting as a doctor in a hospital when they're not, and they're doing all the role playing that goes with that.
is there a big difference between the neuroscientific and the cognitive psychological perspective on acting? I mean, is it
In
more?
terms of, I mean, it's a very small field, and so my study is the only neuroimaging study. We used fMRI. To date, is still the only study. It's only 5 years that it was since it was published. There is cognitive work and also behavioral work. We've done work looking at people's facial expressions and their body gestures, whatever. So a bit using motion capture, so to look at that, how they move and how they vocalize. So a bit more physiological approach, but doesn't use brain imaging. And yes, there are also cognitive approaches as well. Looking at children, like looking at pretend play, and children have colleagues who look at that as well and study what's happening with pretend play.
Maybe you haven't studied this exactly, but mimicking versus acting.
Yeah, I mean, so when you say mimicking, that's a kind of loaded term. So there's imitation. So like, I do this, you do that. So
Mhm.
it's not very, it doesn't involve personality, whatever.
Right.
So there's a big literature on the brain areas involved in just, motor imitation, that kind of a thing. When you say mimicry, I think you mean sort of pretending to be someone. Is that what you're saying? That's kind
Yeah,
of,
just sort of more of a rote performance, if you will. Like if I were going to play you, I would, kind of copy your voice or whatever, but I wouldn't go deep into any motivations and all the other business there.
yeah, there's a small literature on that, about vocal mimicry. It's a different story than ours about loss of self. So ours, people have to go into character as opposed to simply mimicking features. So the literature on just mimicry, um, is a different story than our loss of self, kind of thing, and shows activations in areas you might associate with changing your voice, for example, if you're mimicking a voice. So you see things in vocal and auditory areas when you have to do mimicry. But yeah, like I said, from the gestural standpoint, so I mean, I didn't mention that we had another condition in our study, which kind of gets to your question. So we said, answer the question as yourself, answer like I, Dorian, whatever, but do it with a British accent. And we said, do not become a British person. Do not change who you are. Be you, but simply change your manner of vocalizing so that you answer as the way you would, but with a British accent. And we found that it wasn't as extreme as the acting condition, but it was sort of on the road. It was sort of like an intermediate result. And again, there was no change in the self. There was only a change at the gestural level, but it was sort of our indication, of what could happen when you do this kind of mimicry. Again, we totally said, don't become the British person, be yourself. But still, we saw a bit of these deactivations or, this loss of self-processing occurring, even when you're maintaining your identity, but you've changed something gestural, like the way you're talking about mimicry. So we do have, just, one condition in our study, but suggestion that when you change the gesture, maybe it sort of takes you on that road. You can only have one voice at a time. You can't speak as yourself and with a British accent at the same time. So maybe when you're speaking with a British accent, it is a bit of a replacement of part of who you are, part of yourself.
Mhm. Does acting, actual formal trained acting, change a person's brain in some way?
No
I mean, the
idea.
brain.
I mean,
No,
I
no,
assume
that's
so, but there's absolutely no evidence. People have not looked at, for example, structural features of actors compared to non-actors and or or,
right.
or changes over time. So that's a great question, but that has not been addressed.
Um, how about cultural differences? How do you account for them when you're doing a study? How would you account if you were going to do a
Yeah.
study like
In our case, not very well. I mean, so we're looking at, a few dozen actors. They're all, Canadians. They're all coming from the same tradition. So, yeah, I mean, cross-cultural work, especially for imaging, is very, very difficult. And we haven't even scratched this. Like, we've barely even looked at Western people, um, let alone anything cross-cultural. But the distinction I made between this gestural and psychological is really good because I think most traditions are in fact gestural. I mean, in fact, people put on masks. You look at like Chinese opera and people put on masks as a way to, show a certain facial expression. And so I think the gestural method is the most dominant method cross-culturally. The method acting system that we comes from 1950s American and Stanislavski, whatever, I think is kind of the exception. Is very, very prominent now, but I think it's kind of the exception cross-culture. And I think most acting is done at this gestural level about, just creating the surface of being the character, putting on a mask, putting on costumes, makeup, whatever.
So you study all these different art forms, and it's got to be a little frustrating that there's not that much literature in the acting
Yeah,
realm. Does you're anxious to do more of these studies? I mean, I know you're very very focused also on dance and music, right?
yeah.
So
No, the acting field is a bit of a slacker when it comes to the neuroscience aspect. And I find it very surprising because it's kind of the closest thing to everyday life. Music and dance are more removed from what we do every day, whereas a play is a depiction of a conversation between people, right? So it's the closest thing to everyday life, and yet it's the least studied art form among, the performing arts. So I find that very surprising. But things are changing slowly. I have many more colleagues who are looking at actors now and acting. So I think it's coming up, but definitely music was kind of explosive 20 years ago, and then dance has followed, and acting, theater's very, very slowly, emerging now.
maybe it's a little bit of a taking it for granted itis because everybody figures, oh, we all walk and talk and speak and interact. And
Yeah, I think, yeah, for sure. But this thing about character portrayal that we're portraying someone who are not is much less common. So it's a very interesting phenomenon about impersonation. So I think it should be, and mimicry, as you mentioned, I think it should be much more studied, but for some reason there's just less scientific interest in it compared to things like music and dance that are so much more different.
I'd be curious also to know about the effects of being on the outside, being the audience member.
Yeah. I mentioned this split consciousness about an actor who has to be themselves and be the character. The audience has to experience exactly the same split consciousness. So you're seeing a person on stage and you know that they drove to the theater just like you did that night. But for those, 2 or 3 hours, you have to pretend that that's, Blanche in New Orleans in 1930s, whatever it is. Um, when you watch a play. So you have to also make that kind of the same kind of split that the actor has to make. You have to make knowing that this is an actor who lives in my community, but for 3 hours they're in 1930s New Orleans, and this is Blanche and Stanley Kowalski, whatever. And so they're different people. So you also have that split in consciousness that an actor has to in order to appreciate what's happened. That the world on the stage is separate from the world of the theater, even though it's not.
The suspension of disbelief, I guess they say.
Definitely suspension, but a split in consciousness that the same person is both the actor who backstage is smoking a cigarette and this character in this other world that's being this demarcated by the stage.
I have to ask what you're working on now in the NeuroArts Lab.
Yeah,
Is
we're always working on, but actually one thing that we're working on now is conversations, so maybe a bit less artsy, but looking at exactly this kind of exchange between two people and what happens between being the sender versus being the receiver. Because one thing that we know about human conversation is that there's so little time between your turn and my turn that you had to have planned your turn while you're listening to me. Otherwise, there'd be a large gap. And so we're trying to understand which part of the brain is involved in the receiver in planning their utterance while they're listening. So we're doing a two-person study, one person the scanner, the other person outside, and they're having a conversation, and they're exchanging between the sender and the receiver. We say what's happening in the receiver that allows you to have to speak right away and not have, a 10-second gap where you have to formulate your ideas.
Right. So I guess you planned your response, yet it's constantly being updated as the other person is still speaking. So there's
Exactly. As
yeah,
you're, even though I'm listening to what you're saying, I'm also planning because otherwise it would take me another 10 seconds to formulate my replies. So we're looking at how this very quick turn taking is occurring at the brain level. Another study that we're looking at is in terms of industrial design. So we're very interested in creativity and graphic design. So we're taking artists and having them draw things in the scanner with a focus either on novelty, like make something which is very, unique and novel versus something which is very beautiful. So looking at the aesthetics from a production standpoint. So we're looking also at, industrial design in terms of creating products that are novel versus aesthetics versus very conventional products. So brain areas for creativity is a big topic for the lab.
those are very different, but both very fascinating. I hope we'll be able to talk to you about both of them.
Yeah, no, for sure. They're both in progress studies.
Since you're, before I let you go, and since you cover all the arts, if you were going to make a prescription for everyday health for people in terms of creativity, would you be able to, first of all? And if you were, what would it be?
You know what? I'm not the typical person in this field, and I'm not the cheerleader for any particular thing. I think it's very individualized. I myself do a lot of dancing. I'm a musician, but I don't prescribe it to other people. I think people have to find what they enjoy because if you don't enjoy doing something, you're not going to stick with it. So the main thing is to find an activity which you yourself enjoy, and there are multiple routes to improving health through leisure activities, and some of them involve classical music, and some of them involve playing in a rock band, and some are dancing and whatever. So I don't prescribe because I don't. I think people have to find what attracts them. Otherwise, they're not going to do it for very long. And so if I tell people you got to, go to classical concerts and they're bored and they'd rather go to a pop concert, then, who am I to say you should do one thing or another? I don't think there's any magic bullet out there for classical music or,
That's not.
great art, whatever. I think people have to find what interests them and something which they can endure with, and whatever that is going to work for you. So I don't prescribe. A lot of people in my field do and say there's something special about Mozart, whatever. I don't believe in that. So I just say find what interests you, what you're going to stick with for the next 10 years, and that's going to be your leisure activity, which is going to work for you.
But we do know, or at least we believe, I guess, that when once you find that thing, it's going to enhance your overall.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I mean, people talk about, serious leisure activities that you're very invested in, that you're going to do for years and years, because, an organizer of that activity. Those kinds of things are very health promoting, no matter what they are.
Okay, great. Well, that's a good prescription. Find it and do it.
Find it and do it and stick with it and make it part of your life, and it'll do what you want it to do for you.
Well, Stephen Brown, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fascinating conversation. I wish we had longer, and I hope we have the chance to talk about some of your other areas of interest.
Thank you very much.